What is going on, gunfighters? I thought that a good idea for an episode would be rifle ballistic basics, a rundown of common cartridges, my thoughts on them, what they're good for, maybe what they're not good for. So that's what we're going to talk about here on Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns and gunfighting the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. And on that note, I often struggle with whether to put the bio in or not, because if you listen all the time, it probably gets rather redundant. However, by God's grace, there's new listeners all the time, and a lot of people have their opinions on guns and ballistics and gunfighting, or even hunting, that haven't actually done it, or haven't done it a lot. And the reason I started this podcast was not to become YouTube famous or whatever. I used to do this podcast for years when it actually cost me money to do, because I wanted to put out the knowledge from real-world first-hand experience. So I'm going to put in a quick version of the bio. If you want to skip it, skip around a minute and 45 till you start hearing talk about cartridges. So that's your warning if you want to skip some redundancy. And we'll get into some cartridge talk. Bio. First and foremost, I am a Christian. That is number one in my life, serving God, following Jesus. Combat veteran, served in the United States Marine Corps and the Army. Also law enforcement veteran, private contractor, state rifle and pistol champion. Professional big game hunter and guide. If you feel called to support, check out Patreon. There should be a link in the show notes. With that, I am your host, Michael Milito, and I am blessed to serve you today. Okay, are you ready for some cartridge talk? Some basic ballistics made simple for the common man. If you're a ballistics nerd, welcome. So am I. But I think a lot of people just want to know the basics of a cartridge. I'm going to start with what I would consider the first common. There are many others. The first, and we're going to start on the power spectrum, and this is arguable, but the smallest common rifle caliber used for defense and hunting of medium-sized game. The 223, the 5.56 NATO, and they are different specs, different amount of free bore, but without getting too far into that, if you have a 5.56 chamber, you're ready to rock and roll. If you have 223 chamber, only shoot 223 in it, not 5.56. I'm not going to get into technical specs because this is a basics episode. But notice I said the least powerful. Contrary to popular political, opinion and sway, the AR-15 is not a super powerful rifle. In fact, it's quite weak on the spectrum of rifles. It's marginal for deer. Many people will use it for deer. I was a professional big game hunter and guide. I've seen people use it for deer. It's marginal. I don't know any good big game hunter professional guide where if you ask them for their number one recommendation for a deer hunting cartridge would say 223, 5.56. It's acceptable. You can use it. And since the AR is so popular in today's culture, America's rifle, then it's pretty popular for that. And it's also popular for defense. The most common, I think, grain weight for 223, 5.56 is still probably 55 grain, although our military has adopted the 62 grain NATO. And I don't think that was actually their choice. I think NATO decided that, and we went with it, going from the XM193, 55 grain, to the M855. 62 grain. And there is some other stuff out there. There is a 77 grain Mark 262. But common grain weights range from 45 grain in the civilian hunting world for varmints and things. 45 grain, you can get lighter, but let's say 45 grain up to 77 grain. And you can get heavier, but those are the common loadings. 55 grain is great because it's low cost, economy of scale. It's probably the most popular, so it's probably the lowest cost. Next to that will be the 62 grain. A lot of it is made. Your common full metal jacket stuff is great for training. The green tip is what the military uses. Realize they use that because that's what they use for different mission parameters, that may or may not be the best choice for you. But 223 is a lightweight, high velocity round. If you're going for defense, get a load made for defense, like a 55 grain soft point or hollow point, ballistic tip, polymer tip, something designed for the kind of game that you are going to shoot. If you are going to hunt coyotes, something like a 52 grain or 55 grain AMAX, be pretty good for that. If you're going to hunt deer, you might want to go with something like a monometal bullet, a 55 grain or even higher monometal solid copper bullet, because again, I said this is kind of a marginal thing for medium game. Now, a lot of this is going to be dependent on barrel length and even how the temperature outside. I'm going to give you rough numbers, so if you don't agree with this, this is not canon, right? These numbers differ, but for a rough guess, rough estimate of what you might be getting out of a full-length rifle, 55 grain at 3,200 feet a second. You bump up to like a 75 grain, you're talking 2,700 feet a second. This rifle is good for what it was designed for, wounding. It was not designed for putting men in the dirt with one shot. You have to remember, when we designed this cartridge, and I wasn't there, but this was adopted from the 222 Remington, a varmint cartridge. We were looking at facing the Russians. This was during the Cold War. Mass amounts of men. The thought was wounding a man was as good or better because a civilized, uniformed army is going to take care of their wounded. So if you drop a man and kill him, okay, you've achieved the objective. But if you wound a man and it takes a man or two to take care of that man, that's as or more effective. This was not designed to be a one-shot stop. This was not designed to drop a jihadi, radic Islamic terrorist trying to kill you and everybody else and himself in the process. It wasn't the philosophy behind this cartridge. We've done a lot to try and make it better ballistically, but it is not a super powerful rifle round. It's the lowest one we're going to talk about today. If you're going to use it for medium game hunting, then really be judicious about your bullet selection. The next common one is going to be the 243 Winchester. Now this is perhaps the best crossover between varmints and medium game hunting. The 223 is a great varmint cartridge that can be pressed into service for medium game hunting. When I was a professional big game hunter and guide, and we did a lot of game, up to and including bison, but our bread and butter was exotic deer-sized game species. Most of them bigger than America's whitetail deer. We're talking. We did do some whitetail. We did fallow deer, axis deer, Sitka deer, oryx, things like that. I believe the most popular rifle for us guides was 243. It's a phenomenal. It wasn't my go-to, but it was my backup professional hunting gun, the 243. Also because we had a problem with predators killing our livelihood, right? The exotic game, coyotes, were a problem. It is the best, I would say, crossover round for varmints and medium-sized game. It is great at that. If you're looking for the best crossover round, in my opinion, the 243 still reigns supreme for that. Instead of a 22 caliber bullet, you're talking a 6mm or .243 diameter bullet. And you're talking, instead of 55 grain to 75 grain, you're talking in general somewhere around 75 grain. Other grain weights are common, but 75 to 100 grain. And this is, for all intents and purposes, a 308 7.62 NATO necked down, which just means they reshape the top of it to accept a smaller bullet. So, if you're talking about a bolt action, same bolt face, same overall length, basically. A lot of similarities. It's literally just the 308 case that was changed to take a smaller, lighter bullet. Also has some credence in longer range shooting. It's got fairly decent ballistic coefficient without getting too crazy and nerdy. It flies through the air pretty well. It's a great crossover cartridge. It also is known for having very mild recoil. And it's a great cartridge for medium-sized game. Just to give you a rough estimate on numbers, if you remember the quick ones we gave on the 223, this is launching For rough numbers, 100 grain bullet at 3,000. 100 grain at 3,000. It's a good medium-sized game round. Moving up the scale, slightly larger in diameter, the 25-06. And again, I'm talking about common rounds, right? I'm not talking about every round. This would be an enormously long podcast. The 25-06. Instead of the 308 neck down, this is a 30-06 neck down, which if you don't know is a longer case. So you get more powder capacity. Neck down to, instead of 6mm or .243, 25 caliber. You might refer to it as a quarter bore. It's .25 or a quarter of an inch in diameter. You get slightly bigger, as you might imagine, slightly heavier bullets. Common loadings in this would go from like 100 grain, you can get lighter, but 100 to 117 grain. And with the more powder capacity, slightly larger bullet, this is a more powerful round. You're talking 117 grain, and I should give credit where credit is due. These numbers are coming from the Hunti reloading manual, a very old reloading manual that I have, with many a note and bookmarks in it. But these numbers, Hunti reloading manual, 117 grain at 3,100 feet a second. This is also a good crossover round, but I say it's less equally balanced. It's better for deer-sized game, but not so much for varmints. You're going to get a little bit more recoil. I think in general the rounds are going to cost a little bit more. So for varmint hunting, where you're going to potentially shoot quite a few, I'd say not as good a crossover. If you're reloading, it's kind of a moot point. The little bit more powder, it's going to cost you a little bit more, but for the average person, I'd say it's a better medium-sized game round. If you just want a good, light recoiling, medium-sized game round with a flat trajectory, flat point-blank range. And to break it down Barney style, point-blank range means I can aim at the center of the target and hit it somewhere in the acceptable kill zone of that target without having to mess with my sights, without having to adjust dope, which just means clicking knobs and buttons or holding over. I can aim at it, point, click, and hit. Point-blank range. The 25-06 may be the king of the common cartridges in point-blank range. If you want a good, simple, no fuss, I want to be able to aim at that deer and hit it, and I haven't crunched numbers, but let's say from 0 to 310 yards. It's probably a pretty good guess. Without having to dial anything, I just put my crosshairs on the center of that deer, and I can reasonably expect to hit the kill zone of that deer. And let's be real, the vast majority of deer are taken inside of that range. If you want to do that with a light recoiling, but still very effective round, I'd say this one's good. I also say this one is good for that little bit larger deer size game. We start moving out of the whitetail range, and I know whitetails can get very big in the Northeast, but the average, mid-Atlantic, where a lot of people live, and southern whitetail, if you're getting into the mule deer, and mule deer can get pretty big. You're stepping into the mule deer range, or again, you want that longer point blank range for like pronghorn. If I think of perhaps the quintessential Sonoran desert, painted desert, southwestern pronghorn, mule deer kind of cartridge, 25-06 is a good one. The next common one, the 6.5 Creedmoor. A very divisive cartridge. Some love it and some hate it. This was designed as a match cartridge. Why? It has very high BC. Ballistic coefficient. It flies through the air rather smoothly. It has low recoil. It is great for competition shooting. If you're looking to stretch your legs out and you want a good, affordable option that's available at Walmart, and you want to get into longer range shooting, the 6.5 Creedmoor is probably one of your best options. It's still more popular. You might argue for just that application, 6 Creedmoor is better, or other specialty calibers, but the 6.5 is really the most common caliber that'll let you do that reasonably. Stretch out to 1,000 yards. Off-the-shelf ammo, off-the-shelf rifle. 6.5 Creedmoor is great for that, but it's not only great for that. If you've listened to the episode, A Guide's Rifle, this is a cartridge it took me a long time to warm up to, but it's a great cartridge. It's not only great for long-range shooting. I've got mine set up in a sub 5-pound rifle, Kimber Adirondack. It is a great cartridge, and I use this as a guide on buffalo hunts. Now, I wouldn't recommend that. I'm very judicious about shot placement and things like that. It was my go-to guiding rifle, and I'd rather take the rifle I'm comfortable with, but I would use it on bison hunts, especially on fallow deer and sheep. A lot of, big-bodied sheep we had on the ranch. Great for that. Great for all the deer-sized game, even big-bodied like a big fallow buck. Or known for being tough, a big axis. Great for that. I got plenty of notches cut in the stock of that rifle. It's a great cartridge for that. Caveat, with proper bullet selection. Whereas most of your 243 and 25-06 are going to be tailored for hunting because they're hunting cartridges. This, again, started out as a match cartridge. So I would not recommend just getting match ammo and hunting with it. That's not what it was designed for. Not the fault of the cartridge, it's the fault of you for being stubborn. Get a round and a bullet designed for hunting. I don't care how well that bullet flies through the air. The bullet, when it gets to the target, has to do the job. Get a bullet for the 6.5 Creedmoor designed for destroying flesh, for putting down animals, for hunting, right? Not for high BC targets and just making a mark on steel. What are you trying to do with it? This is a good cartridge if you do your due diligence. I think it gets a bad rap because people go and they buy whatever off-the-shelf ammo and they try to go hunting with it. And again, a lot of the ammo is designed for match shooting, not designed for hunting. That doesn't make it bad ammo, it just makes it a bad choice for what you're trying to do. But the 6.5 Creedmoor is absolutely a good round for a lot of things. It's a good, well-balanced round. The next one that's common that we're going to talk about is the 270. Think of the 25-06 we talked about. Same case based on the 30-06. The 30-06, a great cartridge, will get there. But instead of necking it down to take a smaller bullet in 25 caliber, they necked it down to take a .277 caliber, or 6.8 millimeter, or they named it the 270 Winchester. These bullets, if we talked about the 243 and 6 millimeter, about 100 grain top end, the 25-06 about 117 grain. We're talking common. You can get heavier in all those calibers and in this, but common, the most common is 130, also 140 grain or not hen's teeth. So 130 to 140 grain. And we talked about that 25-06, the 243, probably the best well-balanced varmint to medium game. 25-06, great for medium game. The 270, I think, is the best and lower end of the common cartridges that is a proven capable deer and elk round. So if you're mostly going to hunt deer, but you might one day hunt elk, or you want the ability to hunt elk, and you want a fairly decent point-blank range, you just want something a little bit bigger than 25-06, mostly a hunting round. The 270. It's a great deer round. It is a good elk round if you do your due diligence. If you limit yourself to good shot opportunities and good shot placement, there have been so many deer taken with the 270 and so many elk taken with the 270. You really can't argue that it's a good combination for that. And anything that entails, right? Certainly if it'll kill a big mule deer, it'll kill a pronghorn. Certainly if it'll kill a big mule deer, it will kill a mountain goat. Certainly if it will kill an elk, it'll kill a bighorn sheep. Done all those things, I'm sure. It's a great caliber for that. So elk and down, 270. It's a good choice. If you want a good all-around classic American hunting cartridge, 270. To give you rough numbers on that, you're talking, and this is again, same reloading manual, I'm sure you can get hotter, but we're talking 130 grain bullet at 3200. 708 is a great cartridge. I don't think that it's common enough to put on this list, but it's a good cartridge. I'd say the first commonly available and used 7mm is going to be the 7mm Remington Magnum. The 7 Rem Mag is a great all-around Magnum. In fact, it's often a thing I would recommend if you said, I'm only going to have one rifle and I want to pretty much hunt anything shy of Alaska. I'm not going to shoot it that much. I'm going to put enough rounds to it to be proficient with it and to zero it. And you just are a Magnum kind of guy. The term Magnum just gets you excited. 7 Rem Mag is a good, well-balanced Magnum cartridge. A good way to put it is anything I said about the 270, the 7 Rem Mag will do at a little bit longer distance. It buys you a little bit more distance. The difference between .277 and .280, which is what 7mm would be, it is just minuscule. They're different size bullets. You can't mix and match them. But for real world physics, pretty much even. The thing is, there are a lot more variety of 7mm bullets available, which makes it a little bit more flexible cartridge in my opinion. If we're talking about a similarly weighted bullet, I talked about 130 grain. I got a couple loadings listed here for 139 grain at 3200. The 7 Rem Mag is a good, well-balanced Magnum. I would call it fairly inefficient. If you want similar 7mm performance without the Magnum, I'm not going to talk in depth about them, but look at the 7mm Aud 8, or look at what I think is a really well-balanced and efficient cartridge, but not super common, the 280 Ackley Improved. Phenomenal cartridge. Now, finally, let's get into what I think is the most popular caliber. And caliber is just a designation of measurement in inches. Just so you understand that, right? This is ballistic basics. We talked about the 25 caliber, 0.25, quarter of an inch. 50 caliber, 0.5, half an inch. One of the first, and still going strong, real popular, 30 cals, the 30-30. 30 caliber bullet, over 30 grains of powder. Back then there weren't all these powders we have today. Designed for a lever action, it has a rim. The first one we've talked to thus far with a really pronounced protruded rim. Designed for lever actions. You can get it in other stuff, but lever action is really its bread and butter. Hard to talk about it without mentioning the Winchester 94 and the Marlin 336. Both great guns. 30-30 is fantastic. People think of it as a short-range cartridge. Short in the realm of like 200 yards. When this thing came out, it was a pretty long-range cartridge compared to what else was around. And for a woods carbine, for places where a lot of people live, especially east of the Mississippi, where 200 yards is wishful thinking that you're going to see a deer and be able to shoot it that far on public land. The 30-30 is a fantastic whitetail black bear cartridge. Its two most common loadings is 150 grain, remember we're moving up in caliber, to 170 grain at moderate velocities. And that seems like a really good formula for putting animals in the dirt pretty efficiently. It's by far the least powerful 30 cal we're going to talk about, but it has put so many deer in the dirt, both whitetail and mule deer. It's still popular out west because it was popular for so long. Popular as like a saddle carbine on a horse. Again, we think of it as a short-range cartridge, but a lot of times, how far are you really going to see a deer when you're out riding around on a horse? It's hard to see a deer with the naked eye past 200 yards. The light, quick, fast-handling carbines are great for that. Also, getting back to defense, 30-30 in a restricted state where you maybe can't have an AR, or you got to Frankenstein your AR so crazy that is it really an AR anymore, or is it some abomination that's been made to get around rules and regulations? A good lever action 30-30 carbine has likely been used by many a person for defense. It's a real common truck gun out west. It was even a real common truck gun back east, with Marlin 336. 30-30 is absolutely a good cartridge, and I would say ballistically round for round more effective than a 223. Now, it's not the same because it's usually in a lever action. You're giving up capacity and shootability and a lot of other things. But round for round, it's absolutely a decent defensive caliber. And it's also a really good deer caliber and plenty of elk. It wouldn't be my first choice for elk, but so many elk have been killed with it that you can't really argue that it's not effective on elk. Again, judicious shot placement, picking your shots. But the 30-30, I got loadings here in the 150 grain at 2300 and the 170 at 2200. And those velocities are quite a bit slower than most of what we've talked about, but you got a heavier bullet. If I was guiding, again, professionally, and hope to, maybe God willing one day soon in the future, but if you said, I'm coming on a deer hunt, Let's just say we're going to hunt black-tailed deer. If you don't know, that's a real West Coast, Pacific Northwest kind of deer. I can either bring a 223 or a 30-30. I'd say bring the 30-30. Bring the 30-30. It's a good round. And that kind of country, that should be plenty of range for what you're doing. The next common round, and by far, I think the most well-balanced common round for hunting medium to large game and defense, the .308 Winchester. Whereas I said the .243 is perhaps the best balance of varmint hunting and medium-sized game hunting, I think this is the best well-balanced cartridge, period. End of sentence. If you said you can have one cartridge in a rifle for the rest of your life, you can have a couple of different rifles, but you gotta standardize on this one caliber. .308. .308 is it. If you say, I don't have any center fire rifles, what's the first one I should get? I'd almost certainly, unless you were talking specifically about like an AR, but if you said, I want one rifle, what should I get it chambered in? I'm almost certainly going to say .308 if you give me no other caveats, because it is the most well balanced. It is, in the military term, the 7.62 NATO, and again, there are small differences, but for today's discussion, .308, 7.62 NATO. Now, this is the opposite of 5.56, 223. .308 can be loaded a little bit hotter than the 7.62 NATO. But, anyway, .308, 30 caliber bullet. Real common, and 147 in the military, 150 grain. That's probably by far the most common. And a real common way to remember that, I generally remember this cartridge as 150 at 2800. 150 at 2800. Pretty good, easy numbers to remember. Pretty roundish numbers, 150 grain at 2800. That's generally in my head the benchmark that I'll use to compare many other rounds to, because it is kind of the standard. You can get it in a Scar 17, arguably one of the best battle rifles ever. You can get it in a good classic Winchester Model 70, classic hunting rifle, and any number of things in between. It is a great round. Get it in a scout rifle. There's a reason I think wisely Jeff Cooper decided on the .308. It is a fantastic round. Again, because there is so much ammo available, you need to be judicious. If it was designed for range and plinking, like 147 grain full metal jacket, that is not a good deer round. Could you kill a deer with it? Yes, but I've literally killed a deer with a Smith & Wesson J-Frame 38 Special. That doesn't make it a good choice. I've killed a deer, and yes, this is legal where I was at, with a 25 ACP. I'm not even joking. It can be done with a brain shot. I don't recommend 25 ACP for deer hunting, okay? Because you can do it. 147 full metal jacket, I would say, unless it's a survival situation where that's what you have and you'll starve otherwise, is borderline irresponsible and immoral if you're going to hunt with that. Especially since there's such good, affordable hunting rounds for the .308. But this is a round that's so popular, again, be judicious about ammo selection. There are rounds designed, this is, one of the most common and popular throughout the decades, sniper round. That doesn't mean it's the best sniper round, but it's by far one of the most common sniper rounds. And long-range shooting rounds. There are rounds that are better. Most people would say, and I would agree, that the 6.5 Creedmoor is better for that. But the fact is, this round has been a lot longer than the 6.5 Creedmoor. There are a lot of long-range shooting rounds for this. That doesn't make it a good hunting round. This is a decent, acceptable elk round. Plenty of elk have been taken with .308 with proper bullet selection. If you're talking about something like that, I would really look at the 168 grain to 180 grain in the .308. But you certainly can do it. It's a very flexible round. Again, choose the right round for the right job. 147 grain FMJ is not an elk hunting round. Likewise, 180 grain round nose would be a fine elk round at reasonable distances, but it would be a horrible long-range shooting choice. This is a great all-around rifle. I would say shy of brown bear and moose. I'd probably want a little bit heavier for moose. I'm sure plenty of moose have been taken with .308, and it certainly can be done. It certainly will do that role, but I would consider this a good all-around hunting round for elk size game and down. Black bear, no problem. we're talking big, brown, and grizzly bear, I'd want to bump up a little bit to the next cartridge we're going to talk about, which I personally have done, but a great all-around cartridge. And if you're talking about the best balance for defense and hunting, there are plenty of defensive loads made for this cartridge. Plenty of law enforcement, plenty of civilian defensive rounds made in .308 because it's so popular. It's a fantastic, well-balanced round. The next popular one is its daddy, the .30-06, 30 caliber, adopted formally in 1906. There was a predecessor to that. Anyway, we're going to keep this basic. The .30-06. Give you a brief history without nerding out. The .30-06 came first. The military wanted a little bit more efficient cartridge. They made it a little bit shorter, kept basically everything else the same. That's why you'll hear commonly in common gun culture and vernacular, .30-06 is a long action and the .308 is a short action. And cartridges based on the .30-06, like we talked about, 25-06, 270, long action cartridges. Cartridges based on the .308, 243, 7-08, as a short action cartridge. 6.5 Creedmoor short action cartridges. That's kind of where that comes from. This has more powder capacity. If you're talking about common lower grain weight rounds from the 168 grain and down, really, there's not a lot of difference. But the .30-06 does have more powder capacity, and where it shines is those heavier bullets. .308, unless you hand load, generally tops out at 180 grain. The .30-06 generally tops out at a 220 grain. And that's generally my go-to, like for big, potentially dangerous game, 220 grain. So you're getting quite a bit and get a lot more velocity on the heavier rounds. Because it's pretty efficient, if you're talking about the 150 grainish range, there's not a lot of difference. So why not go with the .308? And certainly a lot more common in semi-automatics for defense. But if you're talking about bigger, heavier bullets for a bolt-action rifle, it'll handle those heavier bullets better. To demonstrate some load data, the 150 grain at 3,000, same load data book. And if we look all the way up to the 220 grain, which again is really outside the realm of the .308, 2,500. And that's got a pretty good reputation for big and dangerous game. So that's the .30-06, and this is a great all-around cartridge. If you said, I want a cartridge that can handle anything in North America, anything in the world really, but for African game, a lot of them legislate bigger cartridges. But if you said, I want to be able to hunt anything in North America, the .30-06. It has taken many a brown bear in Alaska. You might decide you want to go bigger, like a 375 H&H, but the .30-06, there's no arguing it can do it because it's done it plenty of times. It's not just like a here or there, not just like a brain shot. Like it has taken many a grizzly bear, many a brown bear. It has taken many moose. And it's taken many white-tailed deer. Taken many a coyote, I would surmise, because it's a really popular and available cartridge, especially in decades past. It'll take anything. We talked about the 220 grain, but you can also go down to 110 grain. You can go all the way down to similar to the 25-06 in 110 grain. And you can go all the way up to a 220 grain. It is perhaps the most flexible of big game cartridges, the .30-06. Okay, let's talk about the last one, the last common cartridge we're going to talk about. The 300 Win Mag. It's pretty common. It's a big, beefy, belted magnum. Think about the .30-06 beefed up. If again, that term magnum just gets you excited. It's a less efficient cartridge. You're using a lot more powder percentage-wise to get a little bit more velocity than the .30-06. But if that doesn't matter to you, you just kind of want to do what the .30-06 will do, but buy some range, maybe buy some power at the expense of quite a bit of powder and I would say recoil and efficiency, if that's a trade-off you're willing to make. The 300 Winchester Magnum is that, and the 7mm Rem are probably by far the most common and popular magnums. You're talking about a 150 grain bullet. Again, we talked about that in the .308 and the .30-06. That's still a pretty common bullet weight in 300 mag. at 20, or as I was at 3250. At 3250. Remember we talked about the 308, pretty common, 150 at 2800. We're talking here 150 at 3250. And also probably pretty common, the 180 grain, it still lists at 3000. So to give you a rough idea, you're getting 180 grain bullet still going faster than the 308 and 150 grain. The 300 Win Mag. Again, talked about the 30-06. If you want to do what that one will do with more velocity, more power, the 300 Win Mag. There's no free lunch. It's less efficient. You get a little bit more recoil, more ejecta mass. Just more recoil to keep it simple and basic. It's a very common magnum. It's a very common cartridge. And a very capable cartridge. Now there are many cartridges I didn't talk about. But you can deduce by where they fall in between these what might be good. Just a quick example. The 280 AI. If you know and understand what I talked about with the 7 Rem Mag, and what I talked about with the 270, if you know that falls pretty much in between the 270 and the 7 Rem Mag, you can deduce what that would be good for. If you look at the 300 WSM Winchester Short Mag, and you understand the 300 Win Mag, and you understand the difference between a long action and a short action, you can kind of deduce why you might want that. A Magnum in a shorter action. Now let's talk about a cartridge that is not yet popular, but if the military continues with the adoption of this cartridge, it probably will be. The 277 Fury. Now, we talked about the 270, and it's named the 270, but it's .277 in diameter, or 6.8, if you go with the metric designation. That should tell you it shares the same bullet diameter as a 277 Fury. And before you get all excited, well, it does this and it does that, think of it as the classic old 270 in a short magnum. Think of it as, and there is a cartridge, a 270 Winchester short magnum. Think of it as a 308 neck down, loaded to higher pressure in 270. And you can probably deduce what that will be good for. But there's a little bit higher pressure loading in that, but think of it as basically the 308 instead of the 30-06 neck down to 270, the 308 neck down to 270. To make basically a short magnum case if you're talking about the different steel-based case loaded to a higher pressure. And you could deduce what that would be good for. You're going to get similar bullet weights as the 270. And honestly, you're probably going to get pretty similar performance, although out of a shorter action and an overall shorter gun in general. Anyway, I hope it's been basic enough for the person that really likes guns and is into guns, but didn't grow up hunting or shooting or literally growing up sitting in a chair reading ballistic tables for fun. That was this guy. Again, I'm a ballistic nerd. I wear that title. But if that's not you, hopefully this got broken down Barney style, as we said in the Marines, to what these cartridges are, what they're good for. If you walk into a gun store and you're looking at a rack of rifles and you say, I want to hunt whitetail. Well, you know basically these are the cartridges that are decent for that. And these are the ones that aren't. If you have a couple caveats, like I want to hunt whitetail mostly, and I want light recoil. But I may hunt elk. I live out west. I may hunt elk. And you might settle on the 270. Anyway, that's just an example. Hopefully this episode was helpful for you. I'm here to serve you. Hopefully this was helpful. Hope you appreciate the podcast. If you do, if you got any amount of usable knowledge from this and you want to contribute to the podcast, consider becoming a patron. GoodShepherdTraining.com, or there should be a link to Patreon in the show notes. For the fraction of the cost of a box of ammo, any of the calibers we talked about today, you can become a patron. I consider this first and foremost a ministry, and it may not sound like that with all the cartridge and ballistics talk, but I consider the mission statement to make godly men strong and strong men godly. Part of that is providing and protecting for those under you. Hunting and self-defense are part of that. Understanding this is a small part of that. If that's something you want to contribute to, helping men be stronger, better, more well-prepared, consider supporting this. Again, I consider it first and foremost a ministry. With that, I'm going to roll into the tactical tip of the day and the tactical verse of the day. We talked a lot about rifles and ballistics and basics. Let's keep this basic. The dope on your rifle, and dope just means the information required to hit targets for your rifle. Take something as simple as an index card. First of all, I would write what your rifle is zeroed for, its load, the distance. Let's say 150 grain federal high shock at 50 yards. I know for my Scar Heavy that it's zeroed at 50 and it's zeroed again. It crosses that line of sight. That's how rifles work, right? Your vision. Now I know as far as advanced physics go, light is affected by gravity, but for intents and purposes here in my eyes on this earth and those distances, light is a straight line. My vision is a straight line. The bullet is not. The bullet has to be arced. Otherwise it would fall as soon as it left the barrel if the barrel was parallel with the earth. I know that my bullet crosses that point first at 50 yards because that's where I zeroed it, and it crosses it again at 220 yards with my Scar Heavy, my 308-762 Scar. I would write that data on that card or somewhere. I actually write it on the sling of my rifle, but to keep it basic, just an index card. You would write that data, and then how high is it at 125 yards? That might be its max ord, right? The maximum amount that it rises above the line of sight. It's max ord, max ordnance. Then how far down it is at 300 yards, 400 yards. That's your dope. You might write that on an index card and tape that on the rifle stock, whether that's a Scar Heavy or an AR-15 or your grandpa's old Winchester Model 94. Don't go crazy with some kind of crazy tape. Not going to hurt the stock, not going to hurt the gun. You can take it off when that changes. You decided this year I used 150 and next year I want to use 170 grain. You just make a new dope card. Basic tactical tip there. Tactical verse of the day. How about a verse about hunting? Yes, hunting in the Bible. God talks about his people hunting. You'll find this in Leviticus 17. Whatever man of the children of Israel, or of the strangers who dwell among you, who hunts and catches any animal or bird that may be eaten, he shall pour out its blood and cover it with dust. Remember, God designed you. He designed your body. He designed the animals. He designed the animal's body. He knows what's best. He's telling you, when you kill an animal, pour out its blood and cover it with dust. One, do this because he said so, and he's God, and you are not. This is something I like to do when I hunt and guide. When I get to that even-toed ungulate, that food animal, I like to cut its throat and spill its blood on the ground. One, most importantly, because God says so. When he designed me, and he designed that animal, he designed me to be able to eat that food animal. In God's wisdom, this does a couple of other things. Spilling that blood drains it before it coagulates, so it's not in the meat, helping it taste better and preserving it longer. It also saves weight. Talking about doing that and then gutting the animal if I have to pack it out, which I'm likely to do. Many would say that it improves the taste of the meat. So, again, whatever man of the children of Israel, or of the strangers who dwells among you, who hunts and catches any animal or bird that may be eaten, he shall pour out its blood and cover it with dust. With that, men, hopefully you get out there, provide and protect like a man. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.